Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everybody, and thank you for making the time today to, out of your busy schedules, to schedule, to attend this webinar. And this webinar today is we are going to be covering auditing SharePoint permissions, right? We're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about SharePoint permissions, how to audit SharePoint permissions, and understanding really the permission landscape that a lot of us today, as we started adopting SharePoint and we started putting files and really depending on SharePoint to host our content, a new problem started arising, which is, how do we know who has access to what? It's a very difficult landscape for many reasons that we're going to go over. So we're going to cover in this webinar, why we should care about auditing SharePoint permissions, why it matters, and we're also going to cover how what is a good process for us to go about the auditing process. What are the best practices, manual steps, maybe using tools, whatever utilities that we have at our hands that we could use to audit those permissions. And finally, we're going to cover what are some things that we need to know in deeply understand, have a better understanding of what permissions are. There is different types of groups, there's default groups, there's automatic groups, there's external users. All those concepts we're going to kind of cover a little bit and really try to understand holistically by gaining knowledge on this topic and gaining, the tools that we have at hand, how we can truly audit and understand what the permission landscape looks like. Okay, so the format for this webinar is going to be pretty much me walking through the different process, the whole presentation, and then any questions that anybody has will be left till the end. Okay, so we're going to have maybe a 15-minute question-answer session, and of course, if you have any questions after the webinar, we can also you can shoot me an email with the questions that you have, and we can cover that. Okay, so moving on. The webinar here, we're assuming some basic understanding of SharePoint. We're assuming that you have used SharePoint before, you understand the basic structure of SharePoint, and that you have some basic knowledge of SharePoint permissions, right? That you have gone into some permissions pages, that you have added permissions, removed permissions, etc. And if you have not, that's not a problem. We're going to brush up on some of those concepts during the webinar. However, for a deeper dive, if you're really interested in really understanding permissions in SharePoint, there's a free ebook that we're offering. It's actually attached to the GoToWebinar. If you click on the handout, there is a handout there, and that's the ebook. So feel free to download that ebook or go to that URL on the site that you see there. Okay. Okay, so let's start just by really understanding the picture. Why should we care about SharePoint permissions? Why should we care about even auditing this content? Isn't SharePoint, after all, a place where we should share information, right? Isn't it a place where we share information so that everybody has access to it? The answer is yes, that's true. Sharing information with the right people is definitely the idea here, but there's sensitive information that should definitely and absolutely be locked up. And this information in SharePoint can be all over the place, right? Everybody's using SharePoint in our organizations, and people are leaving documents that are sensitive all over the place. And it's very important that we understand why it's risky to have this information open. First of all, let's cover how, cybercrime and people that target your organizations, they are real, right? You may not know about them. They may have not targeted you before, or maybe they have and you just don't know about it, but it's real. They're not just a bunch of hobbyists. They're real people trying to access and exploit any kind of information that they can get access to, okay? And those are, organized, and there are huge organized crimes, all over the world that people do this. There are security vulnerabilities, obviously in the IT infrastructures and the in IT infrastructure as in technology in general, that those people love to exploit. They're constantly looking and seeking and scanning IPs and systems, trying to get into your information, right? And then people, when it comes to SharePoint, those people find the weakest link in the security to be the people themselves, right? So people are a very weak, the security, the technology has been pretty good at being protective of the data, but people have been the weakest link most of the time for intruders coming in and getting access to this information, right? So it's very important that we audit permissions, because permissions are assigned by people, and if they're not assigned correctly, that's a vulnerability, right? Auditing permissions is also important because information could land in the laps of bad apples, right? And this information could leak, whatever the reason it may be. But there are people in organizations that whether they leave on bad terms, or there's accidents with information, or people social engineering other people to get to certain information. It's important to lock things down that need to be locked down. Contractors also come in, right? Come into organizations and leave, and they're given access. They're given access to SharePoint content, and it's important that once they leave, that this content is cleaned up, right? Their access is cleaned up. So that's why it's important to every now and then do audits on information. Examples of companies that have had problems with information leaking include eBay, Home Depot, Michael, Sony, and Target. Those, just so you know, are big companies that made headlines. There are a lot of companies that have been compromised, but you will never know that you were compromised. It's very important to understand that when you have a compromise, you may not know until it's too late. And why is it difficult to regulate permissions, right? Permissions are a little hard to regulate. There are some good reasons, right? The first one is the human weakness, right? Us as humans, when we want to give access, in our specific case in SharePoint, we tend to take shortcuts, right? If I'm working with my boss and my boss says, hey, I need access to this information, and I'm not well aware of how SharePoint permissions work, I might go, it may be convenient for me to just give them full control over the site, for example. So convenience is a problem. And then we say, okay, we're just going to give this person, full access for now. We're going to go ahead and fix it in the future, and then we forget, right? We forget to deal with users, we forget to set expiration dates, and we forget to audit and remove all permissions that we don't need anymore. So that opens up our content to a lot of vulnerability. And then we have also, as humans, we have a lack of understanding and visualizing data, right? Because SharePoint grows and the content grows, there's so much information in SharePoint, it's really hard to understand who has access to what. And finally, it's hard for us as humans, right, to understand the risks of information leaking, right? I like to, I like to tell people that, we just recently started putting our information on information systems, and the fact that when information leaks, we don't see the danger, we just don't feel it, because we've only been putting information on using technology for 50 years, while the flight or fight instincts have not been built properly over those years, right? So it's very important to be a little bit more due diligent in auditing those kind of permissions. So we talked about the human weakness. We also have something called the SharePoint challenge, right? SharePoint itself gives us a lot of great tools, but what it doesn't give us is a way for us to to audit those permissions easily, right? So some of the challenges that SharePoint gives us is, there's a lot of nested objects, right? You have sites, you have subsites under other subsites, you have folders under subsites, you have content, you have libraries, and it keeps going on and on. And then it's also hard to see the picture when you have such a structure. And SharePoint itself, the permissions, if you're not educated about it properly, it could be very confusing, right? So it's going to be challenging if you don't have the proper education. And then just the thought of going in and auditing the whole, SharePoint permissions just sounds really daunting and very discouraging. And there is no process that exists today that helps us kind of go through this in a systematic way to audit SharePoint permissions. So why do we care? What kind of impacts if we have information leakage or breach, right? What can hurt us? How can this hurt us? Well, there could be lawsuits, right? Information in the wrong hands can lead to lawsuits. There could be trade secrets on your SharePoint site that could be compromised, maybe to your competitor. That could cause financial loss. Obviously, lawsuits could cause financial loss. There could be social security numbers, credit cards, medical records, all hosted on SharePoint. Those all could leak, right? And any information that leaks like this, again, is financial loss to the company. And of course, there's compliance issues, right? If you do that, you're violating HIPAA, you're violating different types of compliance, and of course, there could be things, if in the case that this information goes public, things could be embarrassing, right? We all heard what happened to Sony a few months back when, when they got hacked and all this information, emails from producers went online, and they went all over the news. And one of the producers at Sony called Angelina Jolie a spoiled brat, right? And that was just one of the mildest things that got leaked. There are things that I can't even put on the slide right now, but information that leaks could actually embarrass your organization and cause PR crisis, right? That obviously is going to cost money to also resolve. And also personally, as a person who is responsible for SharePoint, it's important that you take care of security, because otherwise this could also mean that you leave your job, or they're letting you go, or getting fired for not properly locking things up. So what is our goal, right? What is our goal really when it comes to SharePoint and permissions? Really, our goal is that no person should have access to information that they should not have access to, right? Information's all over the place. We need to make sure nobody has access to information they should not have access to. This is the goal here, right? So we're going to walk now through the how, how we're going to come up with a plan to do this. So here's the plan. So we thought about this and we said, what is the best way for organizations? We've worked with a lot of organizations, and what is the best way for them to properly audit this information, audit the permissions that they have? They want to be able to audit it, share it, and collaborate to see what permissions need to be. So the best thing that we found is that if we could somehow, come up with a master checklist of all the permissions that exist in SharePoint. And the permissions, this includes libraries, lists, files, everything that exists in SharePoint that is of interest, right? Usually those things are things that have unique permissions. And if we can go through that list as a roadmap and line item by line item, row by row, check things and just make sure everything makes sense. This is the best way to do an audit, okay? Because going screen by screen in SharePoint is a little counterproductive, just because it is not, you may overlap yourself, it's not a very efficient process, right? This is laying out everything that you have, complete visibility, and you can go off that checklist. And then once you have that checklist, obviously you verify it row by row, and you check with the team owners, right, maybe content owners, to see what information, what kind of access is the access that we have today on those items. Are they okay? And then, of course, based on that, we can fix any permissions that we need to, delete permissions that we don't need, we don't like. And finally, we could run this, report again on the permissions and get a sign off to make sure, yes, this new snapshot of the permissions looks exactly like what we need it to look like. Okay, so this is the plan. So the next thing we need to ask ourselves is, what does this Kareem, this permission checklist, what does it look like, right? What should we build? What kind of list are we talking about? The list would look something like this. Okay, this is very basic Excel sheet listing everything. Okay, and don't be intimidated by this. This is actually a pretty easy checklist to follow, right? So the first thing we notice here, which is the first column, is that we have something here called the entity title, right? This is just the title of the object that we are auditing. It could be a SharePoint list, it could be a site, it could be a folder, etc. This other column here is the entity type, okay? And the entity type is, if it's, identifying if it is a site, folder, or list item. And then here we have, the user group is this thing that we're, the person who has access, or the group that has access, we're listing them there. And then the user login name, this is just the internal name of the user. And the type, is this a group or a user? And then finally, the role that they have, do they have read access? Do they have full control? And then finally here also the location, which is the link to that resource that we are trying to understand and audit. Okay, so let's take a look at the first row here, just to kind of see how we can read this. So here we're looking at the first row, and here the first row is saying everyone, which is a group, everyone has read access to the Contoso website, to the home page. So we look at this and we say, does this make sense, right? And yes, it does make sense. Everyone should have access to the main, hopefully this is an intranet site, has access to the Contoso website. So we go ahead and we check that off. You can see a check mark that just showed up on the right side of the table. Okay, so we go ahead and we go line by line and we make sense of this. Now, sometimes you might come across, if you look at line 2 and 3, this information here is, it's related to marketing. So maybe we can't make that judgment. Maybe we are security auditors, maybe we are just SharePoint admins that are tasked to audit the permissions, make sure everything's looking good. We may have to consult with, the marketing owners in this case, because they own this content, and share with them this report, or that section of the reports, right? The marketing site information. And we say, and we go down the list and we see, there's another bunch of documents here. It says Mike's private documents, but Mike has, but John and Mike have access to them. Is that okay, right? So we go through this process, right? But at least we have this guide, this checklist that we could use to define what we need to do. And then obviously, if things look good, we check them off. If not, they can cross it off. And the nice thing about this checklist also is that it's shareable, right? You can easily share it with the team members so that they can decide. They don't really need to know SharePoint for them to make those calls. They just look at the Excel sheet, and you guys can collaborate that way. So now the question is, that's great, Kareem. That looks like a great plan. But how do I build this master list, right? There could be hundreds, there could be thousands of items in there, right? It's SharePoint after all, and there could be a lot of content that we need to audit. And that's correct, there could be a lot of items, and depending on the size of your, of the content that you're auditing, there are manual things that you could do, and there are tools that could help you do some things. Here's a quick brush up though before we dive in to understand kind of how we're going to build this, right? So a brush up on some SharePoint permissions. So the tree you see on the right hand side here is a structure, a hierarchical structure of, a typical SharePoint site, right? So at the top level you see here something called the site collection. So this is the top root of the site collection. Underneath the site collection we have different sites, right? So here's departments, this is a site, and then here we have a library called patient records, And then here underneath that, we have, 20,000 folders with, with different patients. And inside of those, there are items. And, and this could keep going on and on. So we could have sales, we could have departments, more libraries, et cetera, et cetera. So our goal here in order to build this list is to understand the permissions given at each level, right? So auditing site permissions, and then auditing list permissions, and then also, if we need to, item permissions as well, okay? So this is, kind of the structure that we have to follow. Let's do a quick demo here of how we can audit this, how we can audit those permissions. Sorry, let me go back. How we can audit those permissions manually. The first and easiest thing for you to audit as a SharePoint administrator or as a security administrator is something called the Site Collection Administrators group, okay? And Site Collection Administrators, just so you know, is a level that if you are given, you will have access to everything everywhere on the SharePoint site. I have seen numerous times people putting other people in that group that should not belong just because of convenience, right? Even though they're not trained. My rule is never put somebody who does not have, who is not well trained on permissions. Do not give them full rights access. Okay, so let's see how we can see who is in that group. So I'm going to open here our SharePoint site. Now we're diving here into demo mode. And if we go to the top here, and we go to site settings, and then we click on Site Collection Administrators. If you do not see this, if you try to do this and you don't see this, that just means that you are either not in the top level site, so you can go to it under Site Collection Administration. You'll see a link that takes you back to the top site, or it means that you are not a Site Collection Administrator. The only person that can see this is a Site Collection Administrator. So let's go ahead and click on that. Okay, so here we see that there's a number of people here. So quickly you're able to see here the people that should and should not belong here. Obviously, the people that usually IT very trained people should only belong in this list. Okay, so this is one of the quick wins that you could have when you audit those permissions. Make sure and start with Site Collection Administrators. The next thing we need to do is, in order to build our list and our content of the permissions, we need to understand, what sites do we care about? What sites have unique permissions? If a site has unique permissions, it usually indicates that there's special permissions happening there. Something's interesting with security. Maybe this area is sensitive, so we need to track it. So how do we find out what sites have unique permissions, and how do we populate that information into our Excel sheet? So what we're going to do is we're going to dive back in here into the site, and we are going to go to this place called here Site Contents. Okay. When we go into Site Contents, this is again going to show you, as you would expect, all the sites that fall under your site. So we can go into, let's say, the Board of Directors here. And to find, if Board of Directors has unique permissions, we have to jump into those screens and go Site Settings. And we go to Site Permissions. And the first thing that we want to notice when we land on a page like this is this yellow banner, right? The yellow banner here is saying this website has unique permissions, okay? And that means, this is of particular interest. Maybe we need to audit this permissions here because, they are special. So we're going to go ahead and copy that, and, maybe we can paste that into our Excel sheet. So I already pasted them here, but you could go ahead and paste them too. And then really what you're doing is you're building that table, right? So here's our site, here's the title of our site, Board of Directors, and then here is the permissions that we have. And then the nice thing now, obviously, is that we have, once we build this, we have a list of all the permissions on the site, and then we can share this with say the board of directors and say, here are the permissions that you have on your site. Here's the users that you have. Are you okay with them? And they can check that last. They can use that last column to verify if those permissions are okay or not. And obviously, they can send it back to you, etc. At least you could collaborate on this information and those permissions. So obviously here too, if you want to see, sometimes things are encapsulated into a group. So to find out who's inside of a group, you can click on the group itself, and it'll show you who's inside that group. Now, you could see who's inside a group if the group is a SharePoint group, but if it's an Active Directory group, there is no easy way really, unfortunately, to do this. You're going to have to use some tools to do that, and we'll show you how to do that in a little bit. Okay, so back to this. So here we're able to audit permissions and grab the information that we need on each site. Again, we have to do that for every site to find out what needs to be done. I know this sounds like a lot of work, but this is the only manual way that you could check today. You have to do the manual check. Okay, and then, we also want to go down through the list and audit the list. Now, the nice thing about the list is that it's slightly easier because there's a tool a lot of us are not aware of that shows you quickly what has unique permissions on your site. So, for example, I'm going to open this HR website demo here, and I'm going to go to my site permissions. So I'm going to go to site settings. I'm going to go to site permissions. And what's really interesting to me now is that there's an option here that says some content on this site has different permissions from what you see here, right? It's talking about the list. So if you click on that, it will show you automatically, right? I have many lists under here, and it's showing me that only employee records has. So this is nice because it means I don't have to go through each list and audit it if I have 20 lists to really care about the ones that show up as unique permissions, because that's where my interest is. And of course I can go into manage permissions just like we did before and do the do the audit again. Okay. Now, of course, the item level permissions, this is also a very common issue. People say, I have this list, and people started sharing it externally, and there's a lot of unique permissions on this list. I just don't know. There's hundreds and hundreds of items here. How do I know what I need to look at, right? And the same option that we saw earlier, we can actually do the same thing if we go into the library itself, the permissions of the library. You click on show items here. It will show you everything, all the documents that have unique permissions, or all the items in a list that have unique permissions. So this is honestly the best way. There's no good way to audit permissions out of the box, right? There are just too many clicks, too many windows to go through. It's tough to track where you were. The collaboration is hard because you build, how are you going to share something with a different team to see if they're okay? And, building a list that really helps guide you through the audit process is very tedious, right? You just saw we have to copy, paste. Sometimes you have to deal with formatting and not pasting things properly. It just takes a long time. So there are tools that could help you, manage those permissions or even build that list that could really make things a whole lot easier for you. First of all, there's something called PowerShell. PowerShell is a scripting language, right, that helps you automate a lot of things. We're not going to cover it too much right now just because it's a little bit outside of our scope and there's really not enough time to even cover it in this webinar. But PowerShell, lets you write code, and it's really more for a coding / IT admin coder who's able to do those kinds of things. Even in PowerShell, there's some complications. If you have SharePoint on premises, for example, you may use different kind of code than if you have SharePoint online, which is a client-side thing. Anyways, I'm throwing it out there. If you guys are interested in something like this, you could obviously take a look at it. And we have something that we built. Full disclosure, this is a product that we built called the True Permissions Auditor demo. Doesn't have the word demo, it's just True Permissions Auditor. And what this tool does is it tries to address the auditing process of SharePoint. So let's take a look at how that works. Okay, let's jump back into our tool. So the True Auditor is really an app. You just have it here on your desktop, and you could use it. A lot of its tools for free. What it does is, let me close this down. Okay, when you launch the True Auditor, it looks something like this, right? It gives you different types of permissions to report on. And then it also connects to SharePoint. It could be SharePoint 2013 on premises or SharePoint online, it doesn't matter. And the unique permissions report is that list that we were really creating, right? This is the list that we're creating. So I just put in the information here for our site. I'm going to click on Generate Report. Now what it's going to do is it's going to build that list dynamically, and let's take a look at what it comes up with. So obviously it's scanning through every little thing on your SharePoint site to see the permissions that are applied. And here it is loading, and there you go. So this is a full-blown report, right, of all the things in SharePoint that probably require attention, right, things that have unique permissions. So here's one of our sites, right, the board of directors that we looked at earlier. Here we have the web, here we have the permissions, and here we go. This could be a huge list, right, of permissions and sites and lists and items, and in a matter of minutes we were able to generate a full report about a full report on what our landscape looks like in SharePoint. Now, obviously, if I'm working with a certain team, I can copy the board of directors on this. They can tell me if they what they think about their content, if it's okay, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that this tool also lets you do is if we come here, it has a little nifty browser that usually impresses people when they look at it. Okay, and then what it does here is, here I just loaded my SharePoint site, right, using this tool. And then you can see here that everything that's highlighted in red has unique permissions. If I click on, say, the demo side at the top, you see the permissions load on the right-hand side. Okay. Excuse me. The permissions load on the right-hand side. And the nice thing about it, too, is that I can click on any of those groups to see the group members. So I can see quickly who is inside that group. And unlike SharePoint that doesn't show you who's inside of an Active Directory group, this actually shows you who is inside of an Active Directory group, right? That's really useful because, again, the auditing process needs to be streamlined. Everything needs to be right in front of you. Collecting all this information manually, it just takes a lot of time, right? If we scroll down here, you can see here our board of directors site. Obviously we could expand the lists and see the lists under each one of those areas as well, right? And then we can explore here the content also of each one. Now, say you want to make a change to, maybe the permissions here. What you could do is you could right-click. You could right-click on, say, our demo site here. You can go to the permissions. Quickly in the browser, it takes you directly to that location. No need to browse and navigate through your SharePoint site. You can make the changes and then come back, and you could refresh. There's a refresh option, and that will refresh the permissions. So you could, you could cover a lot of ground between that Excel sheet and the tool that you have here, you could really cover a lot of ground with this tool. Okay, so there's not a lot of time to go into a full demo or anything like that. I just want to show you the tools that you have available to you. Of course, there's third-party tools and there's scripts and things like that on the internet, but those are some of the best ways that we have come up with here to do that. Let's go back to our presentation. Okay. Now, before we continue, I want to quickly send you guys a poll just to see. It's going to show you what, if you look at your screen, it's going to show you what, it's going to ask you what version of SharePoint you are using. So take a look at your screen and just with your mouse, go ahead and vote on the version of SharePoint that you're interested in. Give you a couple of minutes. Okay, very good. Okay, so it looks like, I'm going to give you the results here. It looks like they're changing a little bit. It looks like a 40-60, 40 Office 365 and 60 SharePoint 2013. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and close that poll. Very good. So everything that we talked about here, the good news is that you could do those with both 2013 and Office 365. They're the same idea here. All right. So moving on. Let's cover some final notes here, right? Some final key tips. Those are things that we thought have always caused people, they raise question marks and they get people confused, right? It's just not enough education around the topic of SharePoint permissions, and there's new features rolling out all the time, especially in Office 365. So let's cover those things. The first thing that is probably important to understand as a person who's auditing permissions is something called the effective permissions. Okay, the effective permissions is basically the truth. We had a little crash here, but that's not a problem. We can always relaunch this. Slide that crashed. Okay, so the effective permissions is really the permissions are the true permissions. It's what is truth about the permissions a person has access to. And you might say, well, that doesn't make sense. Once you give a person access, they should have that access. Isn't that right? Well, yes and no, because you could give more than one type of access to a person, right? So let's say John Doe has read access on a document. And let's say that marketing group, which is a group, has edit access on that document as well. And let's say John Doe is a member also of the marketing group. There's two contradicting permissions being given, read and edit, right? So what is the real, what is the truth? Does John have read or does he have edit? And the answer is that the effective permissions on John for that object is edit, right? And this is called the most permissive, right? SharePoint goes by most permissive. Different systems go by different rules. SharePoint goes by most permissive, meaning the permission that has the most, is granting the most access, is the one that actually, takes over. Now, the nice thing about the effective permissions, there's actually a tool in SharePoint that helps you check the effective permissions of a user. This is one of the best tools you could use especially manually, to go in and verify, does this person have access to my information? Maybe you made changes to some old information. This is a great tool to do this. And it also, the nice thing about it is that it transcends groups, okay? So it goes beyond groups, you know, and does that. Okay, so on your own time, feel free to check this out, check this option out. Okay, the other thing here that we want to cover is something called external users. This is common with SharePoint Online users. So what are external users? Just to cover them real quick. An external user is a user that doesn't necessarily have a license to your SharePoint environment, but you can invite them. So you can invite a random person from anywhere and have them access your SharePoint site, right? And the problem with external users is that they're so easy sometimes to invite in, and it's hard then to track where those external users are, how do you remove them, etc. So how do we find out where our external users are? So actually there is a tool in SharePoint out of the box in Office 365 only that helps you get to that information. So in your Office 365 admin dashboard, on the left-hand side, there is an option here for external sharing, and if you click on Sites, okay, it's going to show you a list of sites that you have, and if you click on one of them, see here share settings shows that, yeah, sharing is enabled on the site. You click on that, and here it shows you that there are 2 external users who have access to this site. And if you click on that, it actually shows you who they are, right? So this is a nice tool that lists the external users that have ever been invited. And you could also see, you know, if you want to audit, hey, does this person really need to have access? Maybe you want to contact Kareem Rahmani, who invited them in the first place, or maybe, you know, etc. So if users are expired, they're old users, always best practice to remove those users completely, so you can check the user and remove the user from here. Okay, and so there's something also that confuses people. It's called the Everyone Except External Users group. As you do those audits, you're going to see a strange group called Everyone Except External Users. What is that group, right? This group is only in Office 365, and what it is it's an automatic group. That's why you're not familiar with it. It's because it's automatic. It's just there. Anytime a person who is not external user is in your company, gets automatically added in here, automatically, right? So think of those are your employees. Anybody that you invite from the outside never goes in this group, right? So just be aware that this is what this is. This is an external user. Obviously read about it more, but it's very important to be aware of those things because they make a difference in your audit. Okay, and then here finally we have SharePoint Office 365 rolled out a new thing here called Share Everything. In this folder, even items with unique permissions. So when you share the sharing process, now you have this check mark. What this check mark does is say your library had items with unique permissions. If you check this option and you invite somebody into your library, you're also giving them access to those items with unique permissions. That could be a very scary thing, right? So make sure, always make sure that your users are trained on those things. So if you have users that have this ability, make sure you train them, be well versed of what this does, because again, this affects how you manage your permissions. So moving forward, how can you take better care of your permissions on your SharePoint site? The first thing I recommend is to have owner education, right? If you are a site owner, make sure, or if you assign somebody as a site owner, or if you give them full permissions, make sure you train them very well on what permissions are and how they work, right? And it's not just, oh, here's how you add a user to a group. It has to be a little bit more in depth. Auditing triggers and schedules. Make sure you have audit triggers, right? When should you audit? Should you audit maybe once a year, or when somebody leaves, etc. And have those schedules, right? When to audit, maybe you did a migration of data from one place to another. It's worth auditing the security on that. Maybe you have a security review. Maybe you have a recent breach. You need to audit your permissions. Maybe somebody or a contractor left and you want to kind of audit the content that they were accessing, right? Maybe somebody else was modifying permissions and you're not sure if they did it right. Maybe you want to audit that. Take over administration. Maybe you're taking over administration, or you just came into a new company and you want to kind of take over their administration of SharePoint. This is an important thing to understand. What's the permission landscape looking like? And then of course you want to validate controls of a newcomer, right? So somebody else came into your company and you want to see what they have access to. And of course, maybe you're already aware that there's a lot of unique permissions on your site and you want to check those permissions. Another thing is if you have an employee changing roles, right? Maybe they don't need to have access to the old sensitive information anymore because they have a new, completely different role. And the common pitfalls that we see over and over in SharePoint is a person is still in a nested group, right? Somebody is a nested group, and that's why they have access, even though you may think that they don't have access, right? A person could be given direct access to an obscure object nested deep inside, right, with unique permissions. A lot of people forget about that. It's very hard to spot those things. External users who still have access, right? You invite a user or a contractor and you let it be and you never delete the account. A person who gave another person the wrong access, right? Because of lack of training. It happens all the time. So anyway, so today we looked at the risks of having information leakage in your environment, why it's important to secure permissions. We looked at how what the challenges were with cleaning up those permissions. We looked at some audit, a plan to audit properly and thoroughly the permissions in a shareable and manner that is easy to see. We talked about the master list that we create and the tools that we have to build this master list as our checklist. We talked about the external users a little bit, who they are, and kind of how to audit them. And we covered some key concepts that a lot of people ask when it comes to managing SharePoint permissions. And I just want to remind you, ultimately, the goal here is that we need to make sure that no person should have access to information that they should not have access to. This is our goal of the audit. And, here we did our best to show you the tools that you have, in 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And obviously, there's more to cover, but at least, hopefully, this should give you the awareness that you need about this topic. And, of course, if you guys have any questions, you could feel free to email me anytime. Here's my Twitter handle. And this session is being recorded, so you will have access to this session. And we will be taking some questions. If you guys have any questions, you can feel free to shoot them through via the question panel that you see there. Okay, we have a question here that says, does the external user have to have an Office 365 account to be an external user? That is a very good question, and the answer is no. He does not have to have an Office 365 account. This user just needs an email address. So the way it works is when you invite a user, it just asks for an email address. The email address is used to send that user an email. Inside that email, there's a link. They click on that link. Microsoft automatically creates that user actually inside of your Azure Active Directory. It's very discreet. It creates a user inside of your Azure Active Directory and then gives them access to your content. Okay, so no, they do not need to have any licenses or any Office 365 account. Another question says, can you email everyone your presentation? And yes, we are going to share this slide deck after the presentation. We'll go ahead and share the slide deck so you guys can have access to it. Okay, we have a question here too. It says, site permissions are different from document library permissions, correct? Yes, site permissions are different from document library permissions. So you could have certain permissions on the site level, but your document library level, you could have something else, right? By default, the permissions inherit. So a document library could inherit from the parent, which is usually the site. So if your site has X permissions, by default, the library is going to have X permissions, but you can break that inheritance. The best thing to do to brush up on those kind of things is that ebook that you can find in the list here. Make sure you download that and read that ebook. That's a very good ebook for if you're new to SharePoint permissions. Can you use, one question says, can you use rights management with SharePoint? Yes, you could use rights management with SharePoint. We're not covering that in this webinar. This is a very different topic. And rights management, the idea behind it is that you are, I believe you are encrypting the files, as they sit in SharePoint. And that's a little bit different from what we're talking about, but yes, you could use rights management with SharePoint. Again, if you're interested in certain topics to be covered in the future in more depth, feel free to email me as well. Okay, we've got another question here. Is your Office 365 ADFS with Active Directory on site? Does it work the same way? Okay, if your Office 365 is ADFS with AD domain on site, does it work? Yes, pretty much it works the same way. The way ADFS works is, it synchronizes a lot of the local accounts that you have with Active. You have on-premises Active Directory with the Azure Active Directory. So for the most part, all those things that we talked about apply. Okay, and we had also a question here that says, is it possible to role-play a user to see if they have, to see what they can see in SharePoint? Okay, so is it possible for me to see, let's say I'm auditing a specific user, is it possible for me to see what they see, right? And the answer is yes, you could. The answer is there is no way out of the box really to do that. The best tool that you have actually is in the True Auditor tool. There is an option here that we did not cover called the specific user audit, right? If we click on that, let me close this real quick. Let me close this. Okay, if we come to this here, there's a specific user audit. What you could do is you could put in the user ID, okay, and then you could select what objects you want to audit that user against, and it will list everything that they can see, right, and the permission that they have on that. So that is probably the best way to see, and it shows you another spreadsheet of exactly what they have access to. Okay, I know we're approaching the time limit here for the hour. I want to thank you guys for joining, and if there are any additional questions that just came in through, or if you guys have them later, we will answer those questions and shoot you an email with the answers. And once again, thank you so much for joining. And would love to hear from you guys, any feedback and the survey that you're going to receive, and what you would like to see as a kind of a next, maybe weakness that you guys have in your organization. What webinar would you like to see next? What kind of information you'd like to learn more about? Once again, thank you, and feel free again to, I'm going to put my slide one more time up here so you can catch any, my email address. Okay, and if I know how to get to it. Okay, so this is my information once again. Again, there's the ebook if you guys are interested in that. Here's the tool that we talked about earlier, and here's my information. Thank you so much, guys, and have a happy Halloween. Take care.